Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Crop. I'm your host Anna Heslop, and today my guest is Herbage seed researcher Nicole Anderson. Some of you will have met Nicole during previous visits when she was working in Oregon, but she has recently shifted away from Oregon and she's now working in Norway for the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research. We'll get onto that later, but we're going to start with what brings you to New Zealand in this horribly cold and miserable summer.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. Thanks for having me join the FAR weekly podcast. And the reason I'm here in New Zealand this cold, horrible summer is because we are in the final development stages of testing and commercializing a new rapid seed moisture testing device that can be used for herbage seed crops, particularly grass seed crops, but hopefully other herbage seed crops beyond grass seed in years to come.
Okay, who's we?
Yeah, so primarily working on this with a colleague of mine who is a precision ag engineer. His name is Dr. Jing Zhao. He's here with me in New Zealand. He's leading sort of the technical design of the device while I'm leading the agronomic calibrations that go in, so sort of developing the algorithms that are fed into the device.
So you're doing that in New Zealand because it works kind of seasonally for you?
Yeah, so the reason we're in New Zealand, so we've actually been working on this for 7 or 8 years now in Oregon, at least on the field testing side of it. And we're very, very close to commercialization. And so one of the questions we want to answer is, does it perform similarly in other environments? So we have no reason to think that it wouldn't work the same in New Zealand as it does in Oregon, but this is a chance for us to actually confirm that. The other reason that we're here is because there are some species that are grown around the world that are not produced in Oregon. And some of those examples would be things like Timothy and brown top. And so this gives us an opportunity to collect some data in the Southern Hemisphere to add some other species to the device before it's released commercially.
So build it up, calibrate it, and make sure there's no awful surprises when it hits the real world.
Yes. And then the other thing that we're doing is we've actually had the manufacturer, who will be an Oregon manufacturer, produce the first 10 devices. And we're running what engineers call a gauge R&R study, which means that we're essentially testing for variation between the machines. And that allows us to know whether the manufacturer is doing a good job. Ideally, we want to have very low to no variation from device to device so that we know we're not adding any additional sources of errors.
So you've picked a marvellous harvest season to be testing seed moisture because there's a lot of it about right now. What have you seen in the field?
Yeah, so the crops look really, really good. But obviously, I think we all know, and certainly Kiwi farmers know, that this is a really frustrating harvest in terms of the weather conditions being very cool and wet. There can be some benefits to this type of weather late in the season, in that you can have a slower seed fill period, which generally produces higher seed weights. It's obviously important to be making sure that the quality of the seed is maintained, and that's especially important in the harvest process. And so, advice for growers, although I'm not an expert in New Zealand seed production farming, and you certainly have your own experts, but would be to really be making sure that you are monitoring that seed moisture and that you know what the moisture is when you have a window to actually harvest the windrows. And then you're making good decisions about whether or not you need to be drying that crop in dryers. And then also monitoring the seed moisture once it's in dryers, because you want to make sure that it comes out of the dryers at a low enough moisture that you're going to be able to maintain high seed quality and not have issues in the marketing side of things when you have weather like this.
It's very challenging.
Yes.
Let's move on to your new role. Give us a wee update or a summary of what the Norwegian Institute of Bioeconomy Research is, and what they do and how that fits in with what you do.
Yeah, so the institute is abbreviated as NIBIO. That's how it's pronounced in Norwegian. And they are essentially Norway's research institute that works on agriculture agriculture, forestry, soils, and sustainable food production, among other things. But they do both laboratory and applied research in those different disciplines, and also are responsible for grower education and providing various agricultural sectors with research-based information so that they can make decisions that are based with data. So very, very similar concept to FAR. Of course, it's not the same funding mechanism. This is a very large institute. There are over 750 employees, and a lot of the funding is coming from the Norwegian government, from grower associations, and also from the EU. And so it's a different funding mechanism, but very similar in its aims and goals in developing research-based information that's applied and that can be used in practical terms in the herbage seed industry and other agricultural sectors within Norway.
So we would assume that you have joined them to use your skills as a herbage seed researcher.
Yeah, that's correct. So Norway has a goal to be able to domestically supply their livestock industry with sufficient amount of forage seed that's produced domestically. And so they're trying to decrease the amount of imports that they're bringing in and further develop their forage seed industry within Norway. What's
driving that?
Yeah, I think part of what's driving that is Norway is actually not part of the European Union. That's largely probably because they are an oil country, and so they would like to remain independent. And with the geopolitical situation that's going on in Russia, which most people don't know this, but actually the very north of Norway shares a border with Russia. And so they're overall, like many other Western European countries, are looking to become self-sufficient or less dependent on some of the imports that are coming in from the areas in Russia.
And that's from that, I guess, that idea of being self-sufficient. It's not necessarily an economic or anything. All obviously there are side effects, but
that is correct.
It's self-sufficiency.
Yep. And I think that they're also interested in better using their agricultural land. So more than 2/3 of Norway's agricultural land is in livestock production, primarily dairy and sheep production. And their arable land, while small, has been relatively underdeveloped. And it's seen that there could be some potential in Norway if predictions around climate change come true. And so the Norwegian government and NIBIO are making quite a joint push to try to further develop the productivity of the arable agricultural land that does exist within the country.
What arable crops do they grow?
Yeah, so primarily they grow cereals like wheat and barley. You'll also see some silage corn. You'll see a variety of vegetable crops that are cold hardy crops, so things like carrots and cabbages and other root vegetables. And then there's a forage seed industry. And so the forage seed industry is actually quite diverse in Norway. While it's smaller certainly than where I came from in Oregon, it's quite diverse in that they have almost all cool season grasses being produced there, with the exception of the annual and Italian ryegrasses that of course are more warmer. They love warmer conditions and they wouldn't be able to overwinter in Norway's winter environment. But things like timothy and red clover and brome grasses, ryegrasses, tall fescues, fine fescues, many of the things that you're familiar with already here in Norway are produced and can be produced in Norway.
So from an agronomy perspective, as a grower in Norway, what are they dealing with the same issues growers are here dealing with?
Yeah, probably a bit different. So they well, similar in this year in that they do have more erratic weather. So I come from Oregon where weather is very, very predictable. You have a very defined rainy season and dry season, and our temperatures are relatively predictable, although summer conditions have been warming over time. In Norway, they are more concerned about survivability over the winter months. Of course, it's a country that has cooler conditions in the winter than New Zealand does. And even though Norway is not part of the European Union, they do tend to follow some of the EU regulations in regards to pesticides and fertilizers. And so there are some challenges in pest management when you have limited access to some of the tools that are used in places like New Zealand and Oregon.
So in this role, you'll still be working and collaborating with a lot of the same people that you have been in previous years?
Yeah, absolutely. So part of my agreement with Nebio when I was discussing working with them was that some of my international work and collaborations could continue, and they were absolutely supportive of that. And as you see right now, actually, as an example, I'm a Nebio employee who's spending the month in New Zealand working on a new seed moisture testing method that can be used all around the world, not just in Norway.
Okay. So that means you'll be back down in the Southern Hemisphere later in the year, maybe, for the Herbage Seed Conference?
Yeah, I will. So I'll continue to be part of that group. In fact, Richard Chenoweth is currently the president and I am the vice president. So Richard and I work closely together on managing that group at the moment. And I do plan to be in Tasmania in November.
You have to pop over the ditch after.
Yeah.
We'll have our ARIA event the following week.
Okay, very good.
Is there anything that you've noticed in your travels between the US and Europe, anything that you see that here in New Zealand we may not be really aware of with regards to seed supply, seed markets, any other issues or trends we should know about?
Yeah, so I think there's a few different research developments going on in the world. I think there's some progress finally possibly being made in better understanding the genetics of seed shattering. That's being led by Dr. Joe Gallagher in Oregon, and he's we have preliminary data that shows some evidence that there are two genes responsible for seed shattering in ryegrasses, and Dr. Gallagher has identified those genes. And so we have 2 more years of funding to continue to explore that, with the hopes that germplasm could be released for grass seed breeders around the world to utilize, and helping with that important problem that we've known is a problem for a very long time. I would say you're starting to see it in New Zealand, but herbicide resistance is becoming a bigger and bigger problem worldwide. People often ask me, what will you do when you go to Europe and you can't utilize as many herbicides? And I say, well, it's very similar to Oregon. We can utilize almost all the herbicides we want, but when they don't work, you're really both in the same situation. And so I think there's sort of new focus going into some of the precision ag tools, using robots. So autonomous robots are being used now in Oregon that use sensors to identify important grass weeds in grass seed crops. So things like Poa annua and Italian ryegrass are being identified and treated sort of in an automated method using new technologies. And I think that's one area that the herbage seed industry has got to be aware of. Most of the major corporations that are working with technologies and artificial intelligence are not so focused on forage seed crops because, of course, they're focused in the larger crops where there's more revenue. And so I think it's our responsibility in the herbage seed industry to be developing these things internally, so we're not sort of left in the dust with the use of some of these things. In terms of markets, I think most New Zealand farmers are aware that overall there's too much grass seed in the world right now, and that's caused a multi-year depression in the seed markets at the moment. We see the same thing in Oregon. In fact, this past summer when we were harvesting grass seed crops there, many of the seed warehouses actually had seed being stored in piles outside, and that was because the warehouses were full of seed from the previous year's harvest. And of course, we can get away with that in Oregon because we have a very dry summer when harvest conditions, or when harvest is happening. So it appears, though, that turf type seeds have been affected worse than forage type seeds. And so I think it's very possible that the forage type seeds will emerge from this sort of depression in the markets before the turf types are. I don't think anyone in Oregon thinks that this is going to happen in the next year, but that the seed companies globally have brought production levels down to a more sustainable level so that we can produce what the world needs and not be oversupplying like we were a couple of years ago.
Anything else?
No, just thank you for having me on the podcast, and look forward to seeing more producers and interacting with others in the industry while I'm here on my visit.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Nicole. Enjoy the rest of the trip and your new job. And listeners, hopefully by the time you are listening to this, we've had some summer, we've had some hot days, and we've had some harvest, and you'll be feeling good about things. So in the meantime, have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.